Well, Wes, it's good to see you, my friend.
Well, it's good to be here, Rob, again.
Wes, we've got a topic today that I think you've got a little experience in, and that's leading and managing small groups. I'll just be upfront and say that I think you could write a book on the subject, and I actually would encourage you to do so, and I think I already have mentioned that several times to you, and I'll probably mention again, but I know you feel very strongly about the importance of small groups. So I think before we even get into that, maybe just for all of our listeners, we might just define. Would you mind defining what I mean when I say small groups, community groups? Maybe share a little bit of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Rob, as I'm thinking about my own history with that. It was when I was at Ohio State as a student, the organization that I was with, the Navigators, really heavily emphasized small groups. And they were very, very methodical in training leaders for their campus small groups. And I went through almost a full quarter of training where I had to write out very carefully detailed lesson plans, and they made me work on asking open-ended questions so that they generated discussion as opposed to a closed-end question, a yes-no question. And it's not easy to come up with open-ended questions on the fly. You've got to prepare for that. Most of the time when you ask a question in a small group, it has a set answer. That's your default setting. But those aren't good discussion-generating questions. And we had to lay out our whole lesson plan for the small group, including non-Bible study question aspects of the group. So by God's grace, I got some wonderful training the years I was in campus ministries. I was in campus ministries total for about 10 years, and I got really good training for that. And then when I became a part of the church in Oxford, Ohio, Oxford Bible Fellowship, we then started what was called mini churches, and there was training for that as well from our pastor. But all that campus training really served me well for that. So I've been in a lot of excellent scenarios that have helped to teach me how this worked, not by my design. It's just who I was involved with. So I would say a small group, a home church, a community group, whatever you want to call it, a mini church, is a vehicle for fellowship that is centered around the Bible, but is not like a Sunday school. You're not really there teaching the Bible. You're facilitating fellowship through sharing, prayer, and group participation with Bible texts so that the whole group is moving together in those realms. Yes, there's a leader, there's an assistant leader, but it's not a teaching time. It's a time to encourage the folk in the group to sort of exercise their own devotional muscles, sharing what God's doing in their lives, praying for one another, praying for missions and missionaries in the church, coming together to do that, and then looking at the scriptures together, facilitated by a leader who's trying to help them draw out from the Bible what it actually says. So I would say it's really like a mini church. And what were they doing in the church in the book of Acts? They were devoting themselves to the word, prayer, fellowship, breaking of bread. We're not celebrating communion in those small groups, but the other three things we're doing. And we're just doing it on a very small and intensely personal basis.
So is your emphasis on small groups in the church that you have led and planted, is it really because it's biblical to do so, or it's also just makes a lot of sense?
Well, it's easy to throw that word biblical around. I wouldn't say that something is biblical unless it's a direct teaching of the Scripture or a necessary implication from the Scripture. I don't think small groups are a necessary implication from the Scriptures, but I think they are an ideal venue for carrying out all the one another commands. I mean, if you go through the Bible and just see all the things that it says we're to do for one another, to pray for one another, to forgive one another, to confess to one another, to reprove one another, to hold one another accountable, All of those things are best done not on Sunday morning, where it's the big group. It's hard to get terribly personal with the big group. Not impossible, but it just takes a lot more work. With the small group, where you become acquainted with 10 or 12 or 14 other people, over the course of the year, you get more and more comfortable, and there is a default confidentiality code. And so you're sharing things, you're praying for one another, and most of all, it allows the leadership to have a practical shepherding venue in a context where they're really getting to know people. In a lot of churches where they don't have small groups, they take the membership registry and they divide it up, and the elders each get a certain number of people. And so what do they do with that? Well, if they're really conscientious elders, they're calling all of those people and maybe occasionally visiting some of those people. And that's great, but in my mind, it falls woefully short of the command to shepherd the flock that is among you. But with these fellowship groups, home groups, community groups, if you have an elder or elder-like leader leading those, that person is in touch at a deep level with that group of people. And now you've got the whole church being shepherded by the elders. They're doing what they're supposed to do. So I think it's a very, very smart way to carry out those commands to manage the church and for people to get to know one another and love one another. Boy, that's the venue for loving one another. I could go on and on about all the things you can do with a small group emphasis. And if we want to talk about that later, you can ask me about it. But it's a wonderful, decentralized, shepherding, care group context.
Yeah, you've right off the bat mentioned several things about community groups, home groups, that I want to ask follow-up questions on. So I appreciate you sort of putting those out there. Well, let's start with some basics. And some of the questions I want to ask you, Wes, are really just very practical, because this podcast aims at times to be very practical. We just want to be helpful to the pastors out there and lay leaders as well. So you talked about 50 years ago, you started your training.
It was 50 years ago. That's exactly right.
50 years ago.
Thanks for reminding me of that,
for
Rob.
sure.
I appreciate that.
You're doing great, by the way. How have you taken what you saw with Navigators and your training there, and how have you implemented that into the church as far as how do you train small group leaders? Just because they're elders doesn't automatically make them a good small group leader.
Not at all.
So tell me a little bit about how you go about training men. I'd also like to understand how their wives are a part of this as well, the home group leader and the leader's wife. But let's start with the man. How are you training men? How might you suggest how you train a small group leader?
Yeah. Well, there's a number of things that they need to be growing in or getting a good skill set for. Obviously, just people skills. So basic ideas of asking people questions, trying to get to know people on their terms, trying to actually listen to what they mean, and really just being a person that has appropriate empathy for the people in their group and not judging them. This isn't a friendship vehicle. We're not trying to create best friends here. We're trying to be those that shepherd the flock that's among us. And some of the sheep are easier to shepherd than others. I mean, it's just the way it is. So really becoming more skilled in connecting with people. And for men, a lot of times that just boils down to listening, becoming a better listener, a more skilled listener, so people feel like they're being understood. So there's that whole people side of things. Then there's an organizational side of things, because you're running a little group here. So how do we communicate with them? How do we manage and structure the meetings? How do we take care of babysitting needs and help our people do that? How do we manage expectations? You got to think through desserts. You could have a a kale-only group, for instance. And if you say, hey, let's have French fries and Doritos, they're going to be appalled, So you got to find out, okay, what's the tenor of the group? And you got to have some systems in place to manage all of that. So there's the organizational side that requires thinking, communication, some structure. Then there's the content side. You want to be encouraging the people to pray, to look at the text, the Bible that we're looking at, the passage that we're looking at. You want to be prepared to be able to keep, I think about it as a referee. You're trying to keep the biblical basketball from going out of bounds, but you don't want to be the main player in the game. You want to actually help them learn how to play, encourage them to pray, and encourage them to interact on the text, whatever that is. So there's the whole, let's just call it ministry skill side of the equation. So you got the people skill, you got the organizational skill, you got the ministry skill, and then hopefully that's in a structure that is allowing, in the church context, allowing regular meetings for those guys to come together. You're giving them some ideas as to how they might structure their study, but you're helping them learn how to write their own lesson plans, not just take yours. And you're giving them a chance to ask questions about everything from specific shepherding issues to the meaning of biblical texts. So there's got to be a regular training venue where you're coming together to talk about those things.
So you're saying as the pastor, maybe as the senior pastor, you're bringing those small group leaders together to shepherd them and to train them. And
that's right.
Is that a once a quarter thing? How often did you do that?
Our policy was to do it twice a month. So we had a kind of a 3-on, 1-off scenario. Our groups meet 3 times a month. The first and third, an emphasis on Bible study.
The home group meets 3 times.
The home groups meet 3 times a month. And first and third, there's an emphasis on Bible study. So the meeting of the leaders before the first and third would have that Bible study piece to it. And then the middle one is a share and prayer focus. Now, there's all those things going on all 3, but a definite focus. And so we were bringing them together roughly twice a month, early in the morning, and then ideally doing work with smaller numbers of groups or individuals on a one-on-one basis, trying to help them to be better shepherds, better leaders, because a lot of the guys are elders. So you're wanting your elders to be better leaders. And so we'd use the elder meetings also for a time of equipping, so they'd be better shepherds. And the small group ministry was the primary vehicle through which they were exercising their shepherding roles as elders.
It feels like a little bit to me that maybe it's like the head coach is training the other coaches how to coach.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. I think that's a very good analogy, which isn't to say the head coach has it all figured out, but there has to be some controls. And one of the things we did is we said all the groups are going to be on the same page. We're not going to have this group, reading The Shack and this other group reading, Greg Beale's Biblical Theology, and this other group, they'll study the Bible. And we're all doing the same thing. We're all following the sermon series. So that controls our Bible study passages. And we're either using a little Bible study booklet or we're writing our own Bible studies. And then in the middle, we're doing our share and prayer time. And people are praying for our different missionaries. We want to make sure that the small group system is also an effective system for praying for all the mission and missionaries that the church supports. So it's pretty centralized. We're not just saying, everybody do what you want, sign up for the one that's nearest you. And we're rotating people into different groups because we want people to learn how to love one another. We don't want them to have a little BFF group. We don't want the cliques.
How do you prevent the cliques? I mean, people get to know one another. People start to feel comfortable with one another. They share hard things with one another. And then you're telling me they can't just stay a group forever?
I mean, we got a lot of resistance at first when we did this, but we were clear that, look, we want you to get to know everybody in the church, not just your little Fab Five. And so once they saw, it's kind of fun to get to know everybody. And it's not like if you've changed groups, you're no longer allowed to relate to the person that was in your group last year. But we've always encouraged people not to saddle up with just one other person, that there's an exclusivity about that that doesn't really facilitate unity in the church. But we're certainly not saying you're not going to have some people that you just naturally feel closer to. But we're wanting the shepherds to really set the example. So whoever they have as their group that year, that's who they're pouring into. It's like, well, I've got a really good relationship with Fred over there from last year's group. Well, that's great, but let's let Fred get shepherded by someone else.
Well, let's talk about it very practically. Help me understand how you do that, because I think a lot of churches, they try to be practical. They will, geographically speaking, maybe age-wise. Tuesday nights, well, I'm not available Tuesday, so I've got to be in a Wednesday. Well, I can't do Wednesday. I got to do a Thursday.
Yes.
So that just seems like a lot to manage for a group of elders to have to do that. Maybe just give a little help in how Christ Memorial Church would go about doing this, how you led this kind of thing. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit of a complex matrix because for instance, you're not wanting to have 3 pregnant women in the same group because the home groups are charged with staging things like baby showers. So, I mean, we're not probing into people's personal lives like, are you planning to get pregnant this year? But, at the start of any year, a church of our size has a number of women that are already pregnant. So we know that's a baby shower, that's a baby shower. That's a week or 2 weeks of meals afterward. So we're trying to just spread out the wealth and not have more than one pregnant woman in a study. So it is a complex matrix. You got the Tuesday versus Wednesday versus Thursday. We're asking everybody to give us hard stops, not, don't say you can't meet on a Tuesday if you really can and you just prefer not to. We need the maximum flexibility, but we're trying to accommodate everybody. As far as geography, if you've got such a large contingency that's way out there, that's a church plant in the future. So you might just have them meet together. You remember when we did that with the group in Georgia.
Sure.
And in Fairfax and all that. But other than that, people can drive a little bit. It's not the end of the world. They don't have to have their home group that's 5 minutes away. So you're bringing all those factors into the mix, and you do a lot of planning up front. And usually our church has spent the whole month of September going back and forth trying to get all that data in so we can set up groups. I mean, you're looking at other factors like who's an extrovert, who's an introvert. Because if you get a group of, 7 introverts and then nobody's talking, and the leader's trying to get everybody to talk, and they're just all sitting there because they don't want to talk. You get a bunch of extroverts, nobody's listening. They're just talking all the time. So we're looking at all those kind of factors. We try to mix things. We don't want to have a group that's just for singles. The body of Christ is a unified whole. So we're not having just a singles group. We're not just having a, double income, no kids. We're not just having the prime timers who all are empty nesters. We are very conscientiously and intentionally mixing everybody because we want to learn how to love one another, not just love people that are like us and easy to love. So we're going through all of that to look at, okay, we don't want a homeschool group. We don't want an anti-homeschool group, so we're going to mix those people together. The homeschool people need to learn how to get along with the regular school people. We just are not open to in any way catering to cliques. The only thing we promise is if you're not getting along with somebody in the church, you will be in the same home group with them. You can count on that. And, people laugh about that, but the elders are serious about that, and we've done that in some cases where we've had people that are just at each other's, well, not at each other's throats, but we can tell they're sort of avoiding each other. There's tension, and it's like, you're going to work this out. We're not going to cater to that. We're not going to say that's okay. You sit on the left side of the auditorium, you sit on the right. Nope, we're going to put you in the same home group. Now, that may seem a little aggressive, but unity is something that has to be fought for. It doesn't just happen naturally, and we've tried to do that.
So what are you doing? You're telling people what group they're in? It's like, I remember getting a phone call from the coach in Little League, and like, oh, I wonder what team I'm on. Is it going to be the Cardinals? Is it going to be the Red Sox? Am I going to be on the Yankees? Or like, hey, this is Coach Smith letting you know that you've been drafted to my baseball team, and we're going to be in on Tuesdays. We'll see you at the field.
Yeah.
I mean, is that what you're doing?
Yeah, that is what we're doing. But we've set the table in a way that says, look, here are our values. Our values center on wanting to get to know and love one another in the church. And an organizing principle is ideally about every 2 years, we're switching things up. And, in order to try to control that, this will be elder driven. This is one of those things that's centralized. And because we are committed to that, we've asked the congregation to entrust this function to us. And I've noticed over years and years that really they're quite comfortable with that. Once they see that you're acting in a way that is for a very clear scriptural purpose, and that this is a very defendable way to do that. And we've got very intelligent people in our church, a lot of them with graduate degrees. We got a lot of PhDs in our church. But we have blue collar too, and we're going to mix those two. We got the bricklayer with the PhD. We don't want anybody being snooty toward the other type. So people have really not pushed back against that, Rob. After the first couple of years where they're like, I can't live unless this other person is in my group. You have no idea how we've bonded. And, we would say, well, we probably have some idea, but that means you can bond with somebody else. We want to work your bonding muscle here so you're really loving someone else the way you love this person. We don't want any partiality. Partiality is a sin. We're wanting people to love one another without partiality. And, people get that. They see it right in 1 Corinthians. So we just haven't had a problem with that. We've sort of trained them to trust that we're really working in their best interests. And it actually ends up being fun because you get to know everybody in the church. Everybody intuitively knows that's a good goal.
I'm imagining right now there's some pastors out there that are hearing this going, I love that. That just makes a lot of sense to me. That would never fly in this church. And maybe we're 5 or 10 years old, and we certainly couldn't do that now because a lot of times trying to sell people on a community group, you got to make it convenient. We're going to make this work for you. We're going to figure out how it can be close to your home. You're going to get to be with your best friends. We just want you in the community group. But I think what you're saying is that we're going to show you the value. We're going to create a culture, and we think people will get on board. Here's a question for you, Wes. If there's a guy out there listening right now, so I really would like to implement this. Is it possible after a church is 10 years old, 20 years old? Can you do it like this? Can you make these kind of changes?
Well, of course you can. But with a church that doesn't have this culture already in place, you're going to need what Mark Dever calls a superpower, patience. You can't just go in and say, all right, we're starting a home group system. We want everybody to sign up next year. Well, no, that's not going to work. But you are going to have to sell. You're probably going to have to do a one another series. You're going to have to really help folk to see that level of fellowship is valuable, and I would even argue critical to their growth. This is how we edify the body in love, to use Ephesians 4 kind of language. You have to be close enough to somebody to love them. And it's very easy to have what some would call billiard ball fellowship. You just bounce off of one another, no penetration. You can go to church on Sunday every single week of the year and not really have any kind of interpersonal depth with other parishioners. So that pastor would just have to be patient. Now, what we've been able to do with all of our church plants is we seed the ground with that right from the get-go. So anyone now that comes to Christ Memorial Church, it's just the culture. 80 to 90% of our adults are all in home groups, community groups. So once you get that going, then it's just like, that's just what we do. But if you're in a new church or a church revitalization, you just have to be patient. But here's the thing. Church members follow their leaders. And that situation just requires more turning radius for the change because people resist change. So you just need to allow more time for them to see that. And it may be that some of them never quite get it. But as you really emphasize that and make that a key foundation in your church, people will get on board. You just have to be patient. You just have to be patient. Don't come in with guns a-blazing. Go in there patiently, do a teaching series, say, we're going to move this way. And okay, it's all voluntary, but you're continuing to encourage it. It's not mandatory, it's voluntary.
Can you talk a little bit about what you think is a successful night in a home group? What happened in a community group that you would say that was a good night?
Yeah, and then I'd like to talk about what a successful community group in general looks like. So let's do the night first, and then we can zoom out.
Great.
I think it would be a night where the whole group shows up, so there's not scenarios that keep them from coming, and the whole group is excited to be there. And there is robust sharing. People are being honest. They're sharing their joys and their sorrows. There's general empathy for the things that are hard, and there's heartfelt prayer for those things and for other things as well, all a group basis. And then the group opens up the word together. The leader is prepared with good open-ended questions. There's good participation. Folk are wanting to know what the word says. Now remember, that's been set up by the Sunday sermon. So the home group leader is not the preacher. He's not the teacher. He's the facilitator for that time. But we've got the teaching base already in play. So that doesn't mean that we're not getting into theological issues, but we're primarily looking at the text to see how it matters in our lives. So there's a content component, but it's about application primarily. So where people would be saying, based on this text, here's what I'm sensing God wants me to do. And then we're praying and asking God to help us to follow through and do that. And then a nice dessert afterward. Yeah. That would be my ideal home group. Real sharing, real prayer, real engagement with the text.
Before we go to in general, and I want to do that, I want to ask you, did I hear this right from you sometime? Because I've been in your home groups before, and I've been an assistant leader, and that's something I'm curious, maybe you might talk about, and the assistant group leader. What is that? That seems pretty formalized. I don't know if that's typical. Give me an example of an open-ended question that versus not an open-ended question. I know that might seem simple. And then, is it true that you think it's a really successful time when the leader throws out that open-ended question and then the conversation in the group, eyes are not on the leader. Yes. Eyes are on one another.
Yes.
Talk about that a little bit, please.
Yeah, I would say if you think about questions and answers as ping pong ball exchanges, the ideal scenario would be the leader throws out 8 ping pong balls or 10 ping pong balls, which represents the question going to everybody, and then none of the balls go back to him. They just all go back and forth between members of the group. All he's doing is making sure the balls stay in the air. Several fall on the ground, then he may have to pick them up to try to get things going again. And the leader has to be able to prevent the back and forth just between him and one of the parishioners, one of the members, because they want to know the answer. So they'll ask the leader the answer. The leader has to resist that and instead say something like, that's a really good question. I'm wondering what the rest of you think about that. And the next guy will come back and do the same thing. That's a great question too. Any thoughts? And he's just resisting taking that ball. He's just saying, I'm putting it back out there. And I think ideally, then they're actually starting to look at each other instead of all eyes on the leader. But it's hard to do that. And leaders are vulnerable because it's esteeming to be asked. And especially if you know the answer. If it's like, I could answer this so well. I just preached on this 3 weeks ago, and apparently nobody listened. So he really cannot be getting his ego needs met in this context. He's wanting to do everything possible to facilitate them talking, not him. So in terms of an open-ended question, a lot of times observation questions are open-ended just by nature. So we read the text and you ask a question like, what do you observe are some of the things that Jesus is highlighting in this passage? Now, you can't ask that if he's only highlighting one thing. So those questions have to have a legitimate number of answers. They can't just have one answer. Or you might say, just in general, what do you observe about the Apostle Paul's ideas here? Real open-ended. Almost everything qualifies for that.
Yeah, it's almost you can't have a wrong answer.
You can't have a wrong answer. That's right. That's right. Now, you could give a tighter, open-ended question. Let's say you're reading the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus is saying, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And he does that several times. So you could be like Matthew 5:21-48, doing that all over the place. And you might say, what do you observe about Jesus' attitude toward the law? And there could be a number of ways to answer that, but it's a more restricted, open-ended question. Do you see what I'm saying?
Sure.
Yeah. It's harder where the most closed-ended questions occur is interpretive questions, where you say, what did Jesus mean when he said, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes or Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven? What did Jesus mean when he said that? And I'll tell you what happens immediately. All the women zip up, and then your most precocious guy pops up because he's like, I got the answer. Now, that's not a bad question, but there's a way of going about that's more open-ended. Or you could say, it's clear here Jesus is saying something about righteousness and its importance. What are some of the things that Jesus perhaps is driving at with this idea about righteousness? What do you observe, and what do you think he's getting at with that? And you're getting at meaning a little more there, but it's still a fairly open idea. Now, sometimes it's appropriate to ask a closed question. You're trying to nail something down. Did anybody understand verse 23? Anyone want to weigh in on verse 23? What do you think it means? Still open in the sense that anybody can weigh in, but there's a right answer to that. And then application questions are easily open-ended questions. How do you feel that God is speaking to you through this passage? Or what are the key areas that you feel need to change in your life as a result of this passage? It's pointed, but it's still open-ended. There's really not a wrong answer to that question. So is that kind of what you're getting at?
Definitely. Do you try to avoid, or should I say, do you ever pinpoint somebody like, well, Bill?
In general, no. For real precocious types, I might tease them in that way. But no, you don't want to do that. That's a way to permanently shut down half your group for the rest of the year. They're like, I don't even want to come if he's going to do that. So it's a bad idea. It's really a bad idea.
I used to struggle with it and used to get on me about it, Wes. It's like, Rob, you got to be okay with silence. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's not it's not some sort of a competition to see, who blinks first or who talks, who waits the longest to talk. But you can't just be intrinsically uncomfortable with silence, because if they see that just a little bit of silence will cause you to jump back in and answer your own question, they're not going to feel compelled at all. They're going to say, well, he really just wants to tell us what he thinks anyways, so we'll just wait. So especially when you're starting out, you got to let them feel the tension a little bit. Again, it can't be like, I'm not talking until some of you people talk. Now, that's going to lose them. But if you just give a real pregnant pause, I've learned, even when you're praying as a group, there's some people that hate the silence when you're praying as a group. I've noticed that the more reserved people, it's in the context of some fairly significant silence that they'll finally feel the freedom to pray. And they pray wonderfully, but they're not first up. They're going to wait. And if someone else wants to pray, they're going to defer to them. The more precocious types, they've already prayed once. They start praying again. let some of these other people pray. You've already prayed 3 times. Let these people pray so that they are participating, especially in a co-ed group. Give the ladies a chance to pray. They're not going to jump right in for the most part. They're going to be more reserved.
So we talked about specifically what it might look like for a good night. You were talking a little bit, what does a good year look like?
Yes. A good year looks like a group that is caring for one another, not just during the home group meeting, but outside the home group meeting, and a group that is missional. So caring for one another outside the home group meeting. Somebody's sick. They need help with their kids. They need help with meals. Somebody has a baby. They need help with their kids. They need help with meals. Someone has something that needs to be done at their house. One year, I think we replaced 8 roofs one summer in the church, all free labor. And the home groups would have been more central in that process. Maybe somebody just has a smaller project at their house and they recruit the home group members to come over for a Saturday and help with that. They're doing evangelistic outreaches. So maybe they take one of their sharing prayers or have a special party, a Christmas party, a Easter party, some sort of a special outreach where they're all inviting their friends and they try to have a gospel connection with their unbelieving friends so that they're just operating like a small church and bonding in the process because they're doing all this stuff together. They're caring for one another together. They're trying to do outreach together. They're working hard at trying to be a vital small community. And a group that's looking like that, serving one another in out-of-group meeting contexts, I think that's a very healthy community group.
Couple practical type questions. How about kids at home groups? How do you deal with that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's different thoughts on that, Rob,
Sure.
as I'm sure you know. My thinking is that there's great advantage for the parents to have some time alone. So we go to great lengths to try to help with babysitting that is acceptable. Some parents are comfortable with babysitting. Other parents are really nervous about that, and we work with that. But our notion is, and here's the philosophy behind it, the more built up the parents are, the better parents they are. And when you've got the distraction of kids, it's really difficult to focus on prayer, on Bible study, on sharing. You're really doing crowd control at that point. And to me, it ends up being a fairly low impact time that's pretty chaotic and quite tiring. And I like kids. Rob, you know that I like kids. I've got 5 kids. We have 19 grandkids, another one on the way. I love little kids, but not when I'm trying to study the Bible, not when I'm trying to pray. And you say, well, how do they learn? They learn at home. They learn praying in a small group called their parents and their siblings. That's the best context for that. Now, that doesn't mean they couldn't do some special events where you bring everybody together. I think picnics and that kind of stuff on a home group basis is wonderful. But maybe you have a big Christmas exchange. There's all kinds of things you can do. I think it's critical that the parents have some time where it's just about them. We have found, and we've got a very kid-friendly church, we have found that the parents really appreciate that.
And you think the leader should be stepping in that regard too? Hey, we can help you with some babysitters. We know some people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's expensive to hire a babysitter.
It is.
Even if you're up for
and
it.
there might be a finance issue there. I mean, people basically don't want to be a burden like that. So you got to react very gingerly and handle it very delicately. But yeah, it's like, if we could provide some qualified babysitters, would you be willing? Or if, our benevolent fund could help you with some of those costs, would you be willing? The truth of the matter is, most people in our context spend money on all kinds of stuff. They have money for babysitting if that's what they want to do, but willing to help if that would be helpful. So yeah, I think that's part of just good organization and good people skill, because you can't just impose that on somebody. But, let's say that one week the husband comes, the next week the wife comes. It's like, let's talk about this. Would you be willing at least to talk about this?
Yeah, I think so many home group leaders, elders, they might observe something like that. They just don't want to say anything. Like, I'm not going to get into that. That just seems like I'm meddling.
It is. It's a little, we talk about clarity, courage, communication. It touches on all those things. But if your motive is, this would be helpful to your spiritual life, to come away for just 2 hours, your kids will be fine. You can't be condescending or critical, but to try to assure them, look, you're actually going to be a better parent if you can get away and focus on your individual lives. And the home group gives you the chance to do that.
I'm curious, Wes, what your take is on the evangelistic part of a home group. Do you encourage home group leaders in the church to have their folks inviting people to the group? Or, that can be, hey, we're sharing hard things, and now we've got somebody I've never met before, and they're in the living room with us.
Yeah. Yes, and I think if you're doing that, you do have to recognize it probably lowers the depth intensity a little bit, but I think that's healthy because now at the core shepherding level, you're helping shepherd people to value the mission of the church. And, the worst thing that churches do is they become very insular. They circle the wagons, and they don't want anybody to, break up the party, so to speak. And it's like, no, we are committed to breaking up the party on a regular basis. That's our mission. We want to make disciples of all the nations. And you say, well, this is such a nice group. Yeah, well, that means it could be a nice group if we changed the composition of it as well. And so I like that model. One year we had 7 people come to Christ in our home group. One single year. This was over 20 years ago. They're all walking with God today. All 7 of them are walking with God. And I'm telling you, what a thrilling year it was. The end of the year party that we had, what a party, what a celebration. It was one of the sweetest moments in my whole home group career, and that was 7 people that came to Christ. Now, not everybody was an outsider. Some of them were people that were in the church but had just not come to faith yet. Or some of them were people that were in the church, thought they were believers, came to the conclusion they weren't, and got saved. But there were some outsiders too, and it was just a sweet, sweet feel to that group. So yeah, I think everything should have an outreach orientation to it. We should be on mission in every ministry, no insular ministries. Everything an outreach orientation is my opinion.
You ever get folks that just want to come to home group and they don't want to come on Sunday?
Yeah, we don't allow that. That's not an option. The only way that would be an option if somebody is in another church that is not preaching the gospel from our point of view, and will allow it only for a short term. And, see what they're thinking at the end of the year. If they still feel like they want to be a part of that church, then probably we would say, it's time to make a decision because we're not interested in the smorgasbord approach to church. Same way with youth group. We don't really like our church's youth group, but we like your youth group. We'd like to bring our kids to your youth group. It's like, well, yeah, you got to make a decision. What church are you going to be at? And if you're at that church, we expect you to be all in at that church.
Yeah, you don't want to promote picking and choosing. We do
American.
Awana here, we do home group here.
It's so American. It is so American.
Wes, I think what I take from our conversation, it's a lot of things, but one of the things that I take from the conversation is the leadership is really key.
It's key.
It's key. So it's about hard work and training these leaders and then training the trainers, training the leaders.
Which is what the assistant program is designed to do. So part of what's going on is that the leaders are supposed to be helping to equip the assistant leaders. So they're giving them reps.
It's like a farm system.
It's a farm system. The assistant leaders are coming to the leaders meeting. So you're hopefully getting this, synergistic kind of effect. Because you mentioned the assistant leaders. I wanted to just mention that.
Yeah, maybe the last question I'm going to ask you, Wes, as we wrap up. How about the wives? Most of the leaders, I would assume, would be married. Their wives, Do they have an official role in groups that you see, or how do you encourage that? How do you work with that?
Official, no, but substantial, yes. And we don't have a cookie cutter mold for that because all marriages are different. Pastors' wives all function differently. But in general, we're wanting the wife to be a part of the organizational system. You know, if you're arranging meals for a sick family or a woman that just had a baby, the wife of the leader or the assistant leader is probably a good organizer of that. Or if you're having a potluck during the share and prayer weeks, someone's got to organize that. Even though it says potluck, it's not really potluck. And then we used to do this more. I don't know that some groups don't do this now, but let's say you split for your prayer time during share and prayer, male and female, which there's some real advantages to that. You know, if you're wanting the guys to really share maybe some of the bigger struggles, they're not going to do that in a co-ed scenario. And the women are going to be very buttoned on some of their stuff in a co-ed scenario. So you split them, male and female. And you'd kind of want the leader's wife to probably lead that. So there's a lot of unofficial stuff. I haven't mentioned that there's going to be various counseling connections during the course of a community group year. And some of that will be marriage. So the husband and wife are a counseling team trying to help a struggling marriage in their community group. So she's functioning very much as an assistant leader, but within the complementarian construct. So there's not any issue. She's not leading the meeting, that we wouldn't promote that. But and then even during discussions, you know, she's knowing what her husband's trying to do, so she's facilitating that. Sue's very good at this, and she'll see what I'm trying to get at, and then she'll ask a question that will open it up, you know, but do it in a way that doesn't come across as, you know, Wes, you're not really being very clear here, so would you just say this? It's all in the natural flow of the meeting. I marvel at how well she does it. She just lobs me a softball, and it's like, oh, okay, I know what she's doing. Ding! And away I go.
The two takeaways that I get from this, Wes, the things I'm thinking, it really is a mini church.
I think it kind of is.
It's really like that. And mini churches are not happenstance. So that other thing is, I hear a lot of intentionality in all of this. This isn't just, we're going to get together and hope we have a good time.
That's right.
This is really orchestrated, really intentional.
Yeah.
There's a strategy behind this.
In fact, I'd say this. The highest quality organic time is going to come about because a leader has carefully planned. Or that it isn't either planned or organic. I think planned, if it's planned well for maximum participation, is going to produce real organic. And so you don't have to fear that you're going to quench the spirit if you really think it through. You're going to actually open things wide open. If it's not just you teaching, you can't do that. That doesn't produce the kind of thing I'm talking about. So yeah, it's very intentional, and the leader means everything.
Well, Wes, I think this has been a fun conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you about it. Thanks for sharing this. And, you know, I want to throw out to everyone that if you have follow-up questions, send them to pastor@thenetcenter.org, and we'll see about some follow-ups in the future. Wes, thanks for taking the time. This has been great.
It's been fun, Rob, just kind of thinking through what the Lord has done over the years with these groups. Thanks for asking all those good questions.
All right. Good to see you. To learn more about the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization's training and sending programs, visit us online at thenetcenter.org. For questions or comments, email us at pastor@thenetcenter.org. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and consider sharing this episode with a friend. This podcast is a production of the Net Center for Church Planning and Revitalization. Nets, for the life of the church.